Discourse on Inequality by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. A new translation by Franklin Phillip. To the Republic of Geneva, magnificent, most honored, and sovereign lords. Convinced that only the virtuous citizen is entitled to offer his homeland the honors it can acknowledge, I have labored for 30 years to earn the right to offer you public homage. Because this happy occasion partly compensates for what my efforts have failed to do, I thought it admissible here to heed more the zeal that stirs me than the right that should be my justification. Having had the good fortune to be born among you, how could I reflect on the equality that nature has placed in men, and the inequality they themselves have instituted, without reflecting on the deep wisdom with which both, felicitously combined in the city-state, work together in a fashion closest to natural law and most favorable for society, toward the preservation of public order and the well-being of individuals. In searching for the best maxims that good sense can dictate concerning the constitution of a government, I have been so impressed at seeing them all enacted in yours, and even had I not been born within your walls, I would have been compelled to offer this picture of human society to the one people that, among all others, appears to possess the greatest advantages of society and to have best forestalled its abuses. If I could have chosen my birthplace, I would have chosen a society of a size limited by the range of the human faculties. That is to say, by the possibility of being well governed, and one in which, since everyone is equal to his tasks, no one would be compelled to entrust his responsibilities to others. A state in which all individuals were acquainted with each other, and neither the shady schemes of vice nor the modesty of virtue could escape public view and public judgment, and in which the agreeable habit of seeing and knowing one another would make the love of one's country take the form of love for its citizens rather than of its soil. I would have wished to be born in a country where the sovereign and the people could have one and the same interest only, so that the movement of the civil mechanism conduced only to the common happiness. Since this is impossible unless the people and the sovereign are one and the same being, it follows that I would have wished to be born under a wisely tempered democratic environment. A wisely tempered democratic government. I would have wished to live and die free, that is to say, so thoroughly subject to the laws that neither I nor anyone else could shake off their honorable yoke, that light and salutary yoke that the proudest heads bear with all the more docility, as they are made to bear no other. Thus, I would have wished that no one in the state could claim he was above the law, and no one from outside the state could dictate a law that the state was obliged to recognize. For regardless of how a government is formally constituted, if there is a single man not subject to the law, all the others are necessarily at that man's mercy. A. And if there is a national ruler and a foreign ruler as well, no matter how they divide up their authority, it is impossible for both leaders to be duly obeyed and the state well governed. I would not have wished to live in a newly created republic, regardless of how good its laws were, for fear that the government might not fit the exigencies of the moment, either by not suiting the new citizens or they it, so that the state would be liable to upheavals and disintegration almost from birth. For freedom is like the heavy and succulent foods or full-bodied wines that can sustain and fortify the robust constitutions that are used to them, but that overcome, ruin, and intoxicate the weak and delicate ones that are unused to them. Once accustomed to masters, people become incapable of doing without them. When they try to shake off the yoke, they move still further from freedom, taking it for an unbridled license that is in fact its very opposite, and their revolutions almost always deliver them into the hands of seducers, who then bind their chains ever tighter. Even the Roman people that model for all free peoples were unable to govern themselves when they first emerged from the oppressions of the Tarquins. Degraded by the slavery and ignominious work imposed on them, the Romans were at first merely a witless herd, who had to be treated with care and governed with the utmost wisdom, to allow time for them gradually to grow accustomed to breathing the wholesome air of freedom. Those souls enervated, or rather brutalized under tyranny, by degrees acquired the austere morals and noble courage that eventually made the Romans the most admirable of all peoples. Admirable of all peoples. I would have thus sought for my country a happy and quiet republic, whose age was lost, as it were, in the mists of time. A republic that underwent only such stresses as might bring forth and bolster its inhabitants' courage and love for country, and one in which the citizens, long used to wise independence, were not just free, but worthy of freedom. I would have chosen a country diverted from the fierce lust for conquest by a fortunate lack of power. A fortunate lack of power, and protected by an even more fortunate location from the fear of itself being the object of conquest by any other state. A free nation situated among several different nations, none with any interest in invading it, and each with an interest in preventing others from invading it. In short, a republic that did not tempt the ambitions of its neighbors, and that could reasonably count on their help in case of need. It follows that such a fortunate situation, it would have nothing to fear but itself, and if its citizens were trained in arms, it would be more for the sake of maintaining that soldierly spirit and noble courage that are so well suited to freedom, and cultivate a taste for it, rather than from the necessity for the citizens' actual defense. I would have sought out a country where the right of legislation was common to all citizens, for who better than they can know under what conditions it suits them to live together in one society? But I would not favor plebiscites like those of the Romans, in which the leaders of state and those with the greatest stake in its preservation were excluded, in the deliberations on which its security often depended, and in which, by an absurd logic, the magistrates were deprived of the rights enjoyed by ordinary citizens. On the contrary, I would have wished that, as a means of checking self-seeking, ill-conceived projects and dangerous innovations, like those that finally drove the Athenians to defeat, no one should have the power to propose new laws according to his fancy, that this right be vested uniquely in the magistrates, and that they would invoke this right so circumspectly that people would be so guarded in consenting to these laws, and that the laws could be promulgated only with such solemnity that before the Constitution could be disturbed, everyone would have time to realize that it is primarily the great antiquity of laws that makes them sacred and venerable, and that the people soon learn contempt for laws they see change every day. That in becoming accustomed to disregarding ancient usages in the name of improvement, great evils are often introduced to correct lesser ones. I would above all have fled a republic, as necessarily ill-governed, in which the people, thinking they could do without magistrates, or allow them only a precarious authority, would have foolishly reserved for themselves the administration of civil affairs and the execution of their own laws. This must have been the primitive constitution of the first governments just after emerging from the state of nature, And this too was one of the failings that proved the downfall of the Republic of Athens. But I would have chosen a republic in which individuals, content with approving the laws and making collective decisions and proposals from the leaders about the most important public business, had established respective courts, carefully distinguished the jurisdiction of each one, and annually elected the most capable and upright of their fellow citizens to administer justice and govern the state. In such a republic, the virtue of the magistrates would give such clear evidence of the wisdom of the people that each would do the other reciprocal honor, so that if ever tragic misunderstandings disturbed the civil harmony, even the intervals of blindness and error would be marked by intimations of moderateness, mutual esteem, and shared respect for the laws, harbingers and guarantees of a sincere and lasting reconciliation.